Hello and welcome to the nonprofit world. This is where we talk to people who make a difference in the lives of others and in the community. Today we'll meet a person who's devoting her whole life and her work to that effort. She is Claire Bien, who lives in Handom, Connecticut. Claire is an author, a facilitator, a speaker, and an advocate in the field of mental health awareness and mental health improvement. And notably, and why she's with us today, she is the author of a new book, a powerful and moving memoir, Hearing Voices, Living Fully, Living with the Voices in My Head. It was published last year by Jessica Kinsley Publisher. Claire is currently the Associate Director of Fund Development in Connecticut at The Connection. It's a locally based organization that assists people with who are facing major challenges such as poverty, homelessness, substance abuse, mental illness, abuse, neglect, or trauma. And generously, Claire is donating a percentage of the book's royalties to promote development of more social and psychological approaches to the treatment of psychosis. Claire, welcome very, very much to our program today. Your book is candid and it's hopeful. It's frightening and reassuring, both at the same time. But mostly it's a very deeply personal story. It's the story of you.
Yes.
What motivated you to want to tell your story to the public?
Well, it really is astonishing that I have a book that I can hold in my hands, because I kept silence about my psychiatric diagnoses and history for 26 years. And what motivated me to begin speaking out was in part the work that I've done for my agency, The Connection, and which merged with a former Also Cornerstone. And I began working for this nonprofit human services agency that, as you said, serves many of the most vulnerable people in our communities. And we provide services in behavioral health, substance use. We have a large community justice component, working with children, adults, and families throughout the state of Connecticut. So the little plug for my wonderful employer, who has been supporting me in my work for the past several years in terms of encouraging me and allowing me to take time to be to speak with wonderful people like you and Sarah DeGraff. So what prompted me? In 2009, one of my colleagues came to the door of my office and said, I just got notification that a group of people are trying to form a New Haven affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I'm too busy, you go, it's your job. And at the time I was communications director for the former Also Cornerstone. So I said, oh, okay. And she said, have you ever heard of NAMI? And I said, no. But I went to the meeting and I got quite an education. There I met people who were in recovery from many of the most difficult mental illnesses, and their family members. And they were all speaking about, telling their stories, telling about, how they, when they first began manifesting symptoms of mental illness, or when their family members first began manifesting those symptoms, they were confused, angry, devastated, and then, and they began telling the story about how they came to terms with those feelings of anger and loss and began rebuilding their lives. And I was completely amazed because, of course, I'd kept silence for 26 years about my history. I have been able, in spite of the fact that I was diagnosed in 1983 with schizophreniform disorder, which is like schizophrenia, but isn't, because I was organized. I was able to, the main symptom was the fact that I hear voices, and there was a substantial degree of paranoia. And but people with this diagnosis have a very difficult time in life, oftentimes. Or that was my understanding, and I'm digressing a bit because
I was
so if you would
wondering
ask
about
another
what led you
question,
to,
yes.
what led you to want to share your story?
Yes, what led me is, these wonderful people who are sharing their stories, and so I began speaking out, and as I began speaking out, people, were amazed that I have achieved such a substantial degree of recovery, because most people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia tend to be associated with the clients in the agency for which I work, which is frequently homeless, not incapable of keeping a full-time job or a job of any sort, and that simply isn't the case. And over the years, as I began speaking out, the desire to tell my story, to share the possibility of real recovery from what is considered to be an intractable, incurable disease of the mind, grew stronger and stronger. And one of the reasons I am engaged in this work so passionately is that I met a lot of people on the way who were incredibly supportive. I am a writer. I do that as a profession. And I had always had a dream, starting from at the age of 20, of being a writer of some sort. And in fact, when I was first hospitalized, my husband brought me a journal. I wrote in the journal that perhaps one day I would tell the story of that particular madness. And it was madness, because I was incredibly paranoid. I was terrified for my life oftentimes, certainly terrified for my mind. But as I embraced treatment, primarily in the form of psychotherapy. I have taken medications for a short time, but I have, over the past 34 years, since I was first diagnosed in 1983, I have taken medication for less than 2 years. And I think that is part of my success, but only a small part. The larger part of my success is psychotherapy, and the various supports that I have always been privileged to possess throughout my life. A loving family, friends, I'm well socialized, I'm educated, I have considerable intelligence. And so because of all of those assets, gifts that really that I had no control over, I have been able to find the balance between the voices that still manifest themselves from time to time, more often when I'm under stress, and less often when I simply say, I'm really too busy to attend to you. And I digress a lot. This is a complicated question. And
well, let me ask you this then.
Yes.
You said you were hospitalized, but
Yes.
in your memoir you mentioned it was only briefly.
Yes.
You were hospitalized more than once. How long were you in the hospital the very first time?
The first time I was in the hospital for 10 days, and I signed myself out against medical advice after those 10 days.
What happened?
What happened is that what sent me to the hospital is that I had begun hearing voices after my husband and I moved to New Haven from Princeton, New Jersey, and in Princeton, the latter days, the last months of my time in Princeton were not successful, because I had walked out of a job after having been passed over for a promotion. And more critically, my first cousin, for whom I had partial responsibility, committed suicide. And the precipitating factor that sent me into psychosis was the guilt and shame that I felt over the role that I had played, or the role that I had not played the role I had played in not keeping my cousin from committing suicide, in not keeping her safe, and that was because I had competed with my sister to bring her to the Northeast rather than to the South, where my sister was living, thinking she would do better in the Northeast. But I didn't have enough of a career, and my husband and I were fresh out of graduate school, so we had no money. Our apartment was too small for my cousin to live with us, so we ended up, she ended up working as an au pair and then moving to New Brunswick, New Jersey to be closer to school at Rutgers. And within 4 months of her moving to New Brunswick, she swallowed a couple of bottles of pills she'd brought with her from China. And my cousin had been the most unfortunate of my cousins in that particular family. She was just 2 years younger than I, had been sent to the countryside when she was 14.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting story all on its own, yes. Her life story. Why did you check yourself out of a hospital?
Because I was more paranoid than ever. I was not... I refused to follow the prescribed medication regimen because I didn't think I was ill. But I did go to all of the therapies because I love psychotherapy. I love being able to check things out and love being able to, say, this is how I feel, this is what I think, and then having my thoughts and beliefs, countered by someone that I trust. And that's enormously important in really coping with any difficult life issue.
And then when you left the hospital?
When I left the hospital, within a week, I realized that I needed to be in the hospital. I was going off into reveries, and when I emerged, I would find that I had an itchy spot on my thigh or upper arm. I would rub the spot, and it would raise a welt, and it would subside to form a bruise. I was also journaling, and some of the journaling that I did was incredibly filled with obscenities, and that isn't the person I am. So knowing that something was amiss, I called the Yale Health Plan and asked the psychiatrist to place me on a waiting list for a bed at Yale New Haven Hospital. When I was finally admitted, a little over a month after I had first been forced to admit myself to the private psychiatric hospital, anyway, I placed my name on the waiting list, and
And what happened when you were admitted this time?
I was diagnosed with schizophreniform disorder and placed on an antipsychotic medication, which stopped the voices immediately. And initially, the initial dose was a little too strong. It was tapered. I did fine, but I began to engage with life on the unit and with my fellow patients. I then began.
But there were side effects of that medication, weren't there?
Yes, I felt so wooden and lethargic that I Yes, I hated the medication, and by the time and the medication was tapered so that I was able to to get through my days, to engage with other people, to play games. What was interesting is that before I was placed on Haldol, I won at Boggle and Scrabble and various other games, and Othello. And after I was placed on it, I lost. And it's because my mind was operating so much more slowly that I was not able to function as capably as I might have.
I'm curious about, if you could help myself and the audience understand a little bit what it's like to hear voices. Can you describe what it is you hear, what it is you feel? Is it your own voice talking, assuming the personality of someone else? Is it that another person's actual voice? Is it men? Is it women? And what do they say to you?
Okay, when I first started hearing voices, the voices were those of people in my environment, and so I didn't think anything of it. And then for some reason, and this was when I was by myself in New Haven, they began focusing on the content of their verbalizations on me, and I thought, this is really strange, but that caused me to pay more attention. As I began paying more attention to the voices, they did begin to proliferate, and then I began hearing them when I was by myself and there were no other people in my environment, and they are not like my own self-talk. We all talk to ourselves in our heads, not necessarily out loud, and we all, and depending upon, sometimes I can hear myself, my own voice, speaking to myself. But these seemed like voices in my environment, voices that are external to myself. Mm-hmm. And they were the voices of men and women, children, young, and all ages. Sometimes they originated from my environment. One of the things that happened just before I ended up being forced to commit myself to that hospital, that first hospital.
So it was people you knew and people you didn't know.
Right, but voices in my environment, yes. And then later, just voices in my head. And I have some theories about where those voices originate. But one of the scariest times was when I was writing an article for the New Haven Advocate. I had interviewed an artist who was projecting slides of her work onto the wall, and recording my intellectual and emotional response to those, to her paintings. And the kids in our Orange Street, New Haven neighborhood were coming home from school, and when I heard them, I thought, my husband and I had been thinking about starting a family. So I began listening, and as soon as I stopped and began paying attention to the children's voices, they turned mean. And they said, "She sits in the side and stares at the wall all day. She's crazy." And I thought, that's not true. I'm hard at work writing this article about this wonderful artist. So I closed the window and turned on the fan and went back to work. And the paranoia escalated. At one point, I thought I was being spied upon while taking an editing test, and because a friendly little voice had said, whispered in my ear, "You missed something, Claire, 2 paragraphs up in the middle of the paragraph." And I looked and saw, sure enough, that I'd missed something. So I made the correction and thought, oh my God, I'm being spied upon. And when and I looked around, saw no possibility of hidden cameras except maybe in the light bulbs and the wall sconces, so I took them all out.
That had to be frightening.
It was terrifying.
Fear seems like it's a major component.
It is. Fear and stress. And it, and I worry about everything. I, as a person who wants people to like me, I worry about when I feel that I've slighted someone, I haven't paid enough attention, I haven't listened closely enough, or if I give somebody a big smile and hello and they sort of look at me like, and I'm going, oh my gosh, what did I do to offend them? Why are they angry with me? Was it last week when I barely acknowledged them because I was preoccupied with something? And I don't necessarily stop and say, in the moment, Claire, you're really just not that important in this person's life. And that's one of the beauties of psychotherapy, and also just friends, is checking things out.
You address this in your book. In fact, yes. If I could ask you to read a portion of your book where you discuss the fear you had of people, yes. And what they were thinking of you. And I'm referring specifically, pardon me for searching for it, it's the section that begins on page 248 of your book, yes. Where you talk about fear and what you feared the most.
Yes. One of my greatest fears is of being misjudged, disliked or feared for something that people believe to be true about me, but isn't. As a result, the voices that manifested themselves in 1983 didn't need to command me to do things. All that was necessary to strike fear in my heart was to gossip about me. But even when patently untrue, malicious gossip, often has or could have some grounding in reality. It has to in order to be believable. So yes, there was a kernel of truth in the pronouncements of my subconscious slanderers. Even though I had never been or done what they said, there had been or was that possibility, and I knew it. So because I was unknown in New Haven and powerless to dispute the false accusations, I allowed myself to be terrorized.
Do other people suffering from mental illness feel fear as well?
Absolutely. That's my understanding. I can only know what goes on in my own head and also what I have heard from other people directly and read. But yes, many of us who have to deal with various mental health issues are incredibly sensitive, and that sensitivity can be something that is inherited. I do believe that many mental health conditions, mental illnesses, are biologically based. Our brains function in such a way that we are exquisitely sensitive to a variety of inputs. I'm very, very sensitive to energy from other people. Sometimes I can feel I can find that every other word that comes out of my mouth is wrong immediately after having met someone. Other times I'm able to be what I almost just incredibly eloquent, and because I have a certain connection with someone. And it's, I don't understand why that is. And I know for a fact that many other people, especially voice hearers, but I think also people who suffer from, bipolar disorder, anxiety, we all try to understand what's going on within, our physiological responses to other people. And it's a combination of energy, sort of that the body responding, but also the mind, because we are visual. We see so much more than our conscious mind can really process, but it's all there. And so the subconscious, tries to make sense of it. And sometimes when the inputs are inconsistent with what we perceive to be the situation. When, for example, when you go into a meeting, you think, okay, this is what's going on. I'm here to give a presentation, or we're here to, make these decisions. But there are all these underlying currents, and if some perception of what's going on with another person or group of people isn't really, doesn't jive with what we think should be the case, then our minds begin racing and sometimes reeling because we cannot quite understand what that dynamic is. And everyone experiences that, walking into a room going, oh, what's going on here? And for those of us who have this incredible sensitivity to all of the, to this array of inputs, it can be overwhelming, and the sense of being overwhelmed can be substantially exacerbated when there has been a history of trauma or abuse. Trauma is different for different people. My particular traumas were maternal distress during gestation. My mother went back to China with me in utero in 1951 to say goodbye to her parents. So I imagine myself being bathed in a toxic chemical wash, because she didn't mean to hurt me, but she was just so distressed and didn't know for 27 years whether I had survived, and I'm digressing again. But for many people who, especially those who suffer from the array of symptoms and diagnoses that are associated with schizophrenia, there has been a history of physical and sexual trauma, oftentimes.
It's hard to know what is the root cause of a lot of these things, and actually what isn't. When we first started chatting, you and I, you mentioned that one of your goals in writing this book is to bust stigmas.
Yes.
Can you explain what you mean by that and how you're meeting the goal in this book?
Yes, one of the ways to bust stigma is to, well, I described a lot of my really terrifying experiences and went into some substantial detail because I wanted people to know that they can, their loved ones, they or their loved ones can experience have these horrific thoughts and ideas, experience some pretty horrifying symptoms. I was physically jerked around, and sometimes I felt that I was being throttled. Sometimes I felt as if I were being physically pulled up out of my chair. And people have asked, is that what an anxiety attack is like? And I don't think so. I'm not sure. I don't know what an anxiety attack is like. And I described that in detail because I wanted people to see me as I am talking with you and know that recovery is possible. And for most of my life, except during those 3 extended periods of psychosis from 1983 to 1984, April 1989 to early 1992, and then again a much less difficult period from 2006 to 2007, where I mostly had rushingly intrusive thoughts, and I was thinking very strange things, and was also seemed to be tuned to something that was going on in the world, because I did know things that would happen before they happened. I knew things would happen before they happened. Mm-hmm. And one wonders, what is that? Was I being telepathic? Was it, or what is it that I am a creature of the world and I absorb more information than I'm consciously aware of, and because I'm intelligent, I'm able to intuit such certain things. I'm undecided as to, I think it's probably a little of both, because there are people who have certain gifts in many, many cultures. People, voice hearers are revered. They are seen as, shamanism is certainly such a thing. They are seen as people who can heal, who can foretell the future, who can guide a person, a people toward, toward a better life, toward something wonderful. And I would love to share some of the work that I'm doing. I am working with 2 clinician researchers at Connecticut Mental Health Center, Dr. Al Powers, who's an MD, PhD in psychiatry and neuroscience, and Dr. Phil Corlett, who's a neuroscientist. And they, as a result, we've had conversations about how great it would be to do brain imaging of people who hear voices and have never been in the psychiatric system, only a little over 30% of voice hearers end up in the psychiatric system, are known, mm-hmm. And another 30% have 1 episode or maybe 2 episodes of acute psychosis, recover, and are never heard from again. And they're effectively lost to the system, even though they may have interacted with it at one point. Then another 30% or 30-odd% never enter the psychiatric system. People of faith fall in that category, and also a group of clairaudient psychics that doctors Corlett and Powers advertised for and interviewed. And what they did was they scanned the brains doing fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging scans of the clairaudient psychics when they were hearing voices. And they compared them with the fMRI scans of voice hearers when they were hearing voices. And the images looked very similar.
That's
And
fascinating.
they wrote an article that was published in Science magazine, and then a popular article was written about their research and published in Atlantic magazine. They've also done another study where they trained non-voice hearers to hear voices using Pavlovian techniques. So anybody can hear voices. It's just a matter of paying attention, and that's that's part of my passion. Is that my belief is my passion is to really sort of publicize the fact that recovery is possible, that voice hearing need not be something to be feared, and in fact, many people love their voices, treat them as friends. For those of us who had secret friends when we were children, and I was not among them, but there is one leader in the Hearing Voices movement who lives in Massachusetts, started hearing voices when she was a child. She was living in the Far East with her family, and she felt very isolated. So she began having imaginary friends, and she would never, ever give up her voices. Others have learned to achieve a working relationship, even a constructive relationship with their voices, even the difficult ones, because the difficult voices in our heads are telling us something that is important. And the reigning wisdom among the mental health professionals, as well as people in the Hearing Voices movement, is that the voices in our heads reflect unresolved emotion. And so many of us tend to be caregivers and keep everything well hidden, and not wanting to distress other people whose difficulties are so much greater than our own.
And keeping it to yourself is not necessarily the best treatment.
Exactly.
Or the best approach.
And so, when whether it's the ego or just our need to take care of, to exercise good self-care comes to the fore, and we still don't pay attention, then they begin, really shouting at us and sometimes saying unkind things because they're trying to get us to pay attention.
It makes me wonder, because most of what I know, and I would imagine what a lot of people think they know about thought hearers, voice hearers, is what we've seen in popular culture. And one of the things that jumps out is the stunning movie A Beautiful Mind about mathematician John Nash. We have a better understanding in popular culture today of mental illness than we did several decades ago. Things are improving. Can you comment on that movie?
I thought the movie was wonderful and wasn't as good as the book, but I think it's very, no. And it would be impossible anyway, but I thought it was really well done. And I think that John Nash's life, was remarkable. He is another person who, it's odd to be speaking of him, speaking of his life in the context of mine, but there are a number of people who have, suffered terribly. I think his symptoms were far worse than mine. He had a much more difficult life than I did. And I tend to, it's not clear to me why that is. I think part of the reason is that he was so very ambitious. I think people, one of the things that really causes the voices to proliferate or to become more difficult is the degree of stress that we are under or place on ourselves. People who are very, very high achieving place inordinate amounts of stress upon themselves. Ellen Sachs, who is a MacArthur Genius Award winner, wrote the amazing memoir, The Center Cannot Hold. She teaches at USC Law School and is also a psychoanalyst. But, you know, she, John Nash, Kay Redfield Jamison, who is bipolar, all of these people are very, very high achieving. And in order to achieve so much, they, you know, pull all-nighters a lot. If I don't get enough sleep, I do not do well. My voices begin to proliferate. And oftentimes I'm probably more mildly bipolar than whatever. It's not clear what my diagnoses are, and my friends in the Hearing Voices movement are probably cringing because I'm using all of these diagnoses, but that's okay.
Well, let's bring it back around to the work that you do. When obviously you're able to live a productive life, you go to the office every day or whatever your assignments are. With your phenomenal background and the fact that you can live, from what on the outside at least seems to be a fairly normal life.
Yes.
What do you bring to your current work? What are you sharing on a day-to-day basis, week to week, month to month, with others who could certainly use attention that you can give to them?
Well, for my job, my 9-to-5 job, is as a writer and grant writer. And just before coming here, I got notification from this is great, the Thomas Atkins Memorial Fund. We received a $10,000 grant for the Eddy Shelter for homeless men and women in Middletown. So I'm very pleased about that. I also interview clients in our agency and write good news stories, success stories. So I'm the good news gal in the agency. And I also I also do a lot of volunteer work. I am a Hearing Voices Network support group facilitator and facilitate a support group at Yale Psychiatric Hospital. We're taking a bit of a break because they're reorganizing, but I will resume in January. I also co-facilitate a support group in the New Haven community for adolescents and young adults. And I have been working with a psychiatric resident to engage with a young man who's having a very difficult time. So there's, as people, speak to me and learn about the ways in which hear about the ways in which I've learned to cope with my voices, including standing up to them, asking questions. Really, I found that my most difficult voices aren't very creative, and they're not as smart as I am. And when I begin questioning them or challenging the content of their pronouncements, then they will back off, unless what they're saying about me is true, in which case I always acknowledge that they are, they're accurate, and I am working on being better. So the things that I bring are a desire to be helpful, a degree of understanding. We with lived experience are called experts by experience. We have an intimate knowledge and understanding of our particular mental health issues and can provide a great deal of insight to practitioners and researchers, but also to people who are also struggling. And really being able to hear someone say something and to sort of take that information and internalize it and feel the response is wonderful. I find that when I do it really well, the person with whom the person with who is struggling usually responds very positively. He says, yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, when I described some of my experiences and the fears in my book, a lot of friends and acquaintances who also struggle said, that's exactly the way it was for me. And that has been, for me, wonderfully gratifying.
And thus, the existence of support groups all around the state,
exactly.
Correct?
Yes, it's amazing. The Connecticut Hearing Voices Network, which came to Connecticut in April of 2014, under then Commissioner of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, Pat Reamer, and her staff member, Ronna Kyle, who is the Director of Recovery Community Affairs. So 2014, just 3.5 years ago, there are now 21 Hearing Voices Network support and resource groups around the state, in just about every corner of the state.
And I understand that these sessions, when they get together,
Yes.
they're not meant to be therapeutic. They're meant to be a means of support.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so what happens when you're able to actually spend time with other voice hearers?
Well,
That must be phenomenally wonderful.
yes, you don't feel alone, and you also get really good ideas as to how to address your voices. But just the fact of not feeling alone, not feeling that, and also having hope, because of course support groups have people at, in varying stages of recovery, some who are doing very, very well, some of whom are traveling the world and training other people, practitioners about, the real and substantial hope for recovery, or just learning to live with the voices. I'm not closely aligned enough with the HVN to have all the appropriate language.
But you have traveled to South America to spread the
Yes.
word, haven't you?
I have. I was through friends at church, and now at work, I was invited to go to Brazil to the first ever recovery conference, and I spoke about my recovery story and also about the Hearing Voices Network support group facilitation that I engage in.
That had to be fun.
It was.
But also probably a little scary, because perhaps I'm wrong, but I think some countries, such as ours, have evolved in our understanding of mental illnesses and are a bit more accepting of them than even used to be in the past here in this country.
So are you saying that the United States is ahead of, in some ways?
To some countries, this may be a whole new concept, that it is treatable. It's not necessarily chronic.
Actually, some of the people I met in Brazil had participated. One woman had been a graduate student in the United States, and she got a SAMHSA grant to start a Hearing Voices Network support group program in Rio, at the University of Rio.
Excellent.
So, in fact, they were ahead of us.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. The United States is behind the times.
You continue to be a
HVN.
stigma buster.
Yes, I mean, it really is important, because I think with appropriate supports, certainly familial, family and friends, but also communities, with appropriate community supports where there is less fear of people with mental illness. And it's understandable, people who are suffering and who are frightened often behave in very distressing ways and can be disruptive. And when you're trying to get your work done or trying to be whatever, and someone behaves in a way that is not to your liking or your expectation, then the tendency for all of us very busy people is to either brush aside or try to shut that person down. And that's devastating for someone who is terrified to be brushed aside or to be treated badly. Really exacerbates the feelings of distress and can exacerbate the symptoms. And, it's such a difficult thing because, we're all very busy people and we all have our own lives, and taking the time to look at someone as a human being who looks different, who acts different, who probably is different, is very challenging. And to expect everyone to do that at all times is completely unrealistic. And that's where agencies like The Connection and an array of wonderful, wonderful human services agencies throughout the United States, Advocacy Unlimited, which is the fiduciary for the Connecticut Hearing Voices Network, NAMI Connecticut, which really, NAMI, I did say National Alliance, I meant
yes, you did.
earlier, didn't I? So NAMI, National, NAMI Connecticut, which really brought, brought the conversation of recovery and the possibility of hope to people's consciousness, which really allowed much of the work that is being done in recovery, many of the understandings to come to the fore. There are each organization has its blindnesses, has its flaws, has its weaknesses, but together we are working to try to develop new therapies, combinations of therapies, medication if necessary, lowest possible dosages, therapy, lots of peer supports. Peer supports are hugely important, as I've touched upon in our conversation just now. People with lived experience can understand other people who are struggling so much more readily than someone who has read all about these mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, all of those names, we're not just an array of symptoms, we are people, and we have histories, and when people take the time to delve into our stories, our past, what we experienced, how we suffered at the hands of this or that person, how we inflicted suffering upon ourselves because we were mortified that we hurt another person. When people take the time to hear our stories and to work with us in learning, teaching us, helping us learn to accept that no one's perfect, try to forgive ourselves, then recovery becomes possible.
You once said something to me that I thought fascinating, and it sort of turned something on its head in my understanding. You mentioned that many people fear someone who has a mental illness,
yes,
whereas in fact, it's the person with the mental illness who is truly in fear.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. When someone meets someone with a mental illness, what advice would you give the person who's meeting the person with the mental illness? And maybe put it another way, what would that person with the mental illness like to be able to tell this person they're just meeting? What should we know?
Well, it depends upon the circumstance. If the person who is struggling looks wild-eyed, but is approaching you, the most important thing is to be calm, not to show fear, not to show anger. And sometimes that's difficult. But because, as I said earlier, we who struggle are often exquisitely sensitive, and we can feel, and innumerable things can trigger us, so that look of fear can prompt something to take place in the person who's struggling's mind. Or, a show of anger or irritation can do something else. But just remaining calm. If the person engages you, just, listen and try to respond as sincerely as possible. And then, what I would do is, disengage. If I feel safe, if I myself feel safe, then I may continue engaging. If I don't feel safe for whatever reason, then I will very gently try to disengage. And and a lot of times, as a woman, I don't always feel safe, and that's probably wise. I often don't make eye contact, but if you should make eye contact with someone and they begin engaging, the main thing is to be as calm as possible, engage as much as necessary, and then very gently disengage. If they seem to be in trouble, I think it would be really important. For example, if they're really, the thing to do would be to try to get help, ask if they need help, or
That's a good suggestion.
And
that makes sense. Toward the end of your book, you address this in a way, probably not exactly the way we've been talking about it now, and I wonder if you could read another passage from your book, where society is re-engaging and is welcoming people back. And this is the passage on page 267, Claire.
yes.
About bringing people with mental illnesses back into the world and what we need to provide for them. Could you read that for us?
Yes. If people who live with mental illness are to use their reason to draw them back to the world, and this presumes that they can use their reason to draw themselves back to the world, and I think that most people can, and that's, sorry, my soapbox. Then we must give them, okay, let me start over. If people who live with mental illness are to use their reason to draw them back to the world, then we must give them a reason to wish to be in it. Many useful tools have been developed by the medical, scientific, and psychotherapeutic communities. Medication is a part of the solution, but it is only one part. The various interventions that are an integral part of the community mental health movement are far more important. Person-centered therapy, the use of peer counselors, and the clear understanding that meaningful work and true acceptance by and full integration within the broader community, the community outside the mental health arena, are also critical to the recovery process of living and being in the world. I hope that the increased political will to support mental health treatment within the United States will result in more access to psychotherapy, and I hope that there will be increased political will, and will result in more access to psychotherapy and non-medical interventions. I hope there will be a concerted effort to build communities that provide a safe haven, especially for people still in the depths of mental illness and in the early stages of recovery. A community in which we are known, accepted, trust, and are trusted, and in which we feel safe, nurtured, and understood, is a community in which we can live and grow. May we work together to build that community for ourselves and for the world.
Thank you. And thank you for the fact that you're putting into action what the words of hope are in your book. We'd like to thank you for being a terrific champion of what you have done, that you've courageously brought the examples of your life into a book that can be a help to so many people. And thank you for the work that you do every day. The fact that you go to work every day and you make an impact every day.
I wouldn't be here if I didn't go to work every day, because that's part of what keeps me focused and, able to live in the world.
Here's the book, Hearing Voices, Living Fully, by Claire Bien, our guest today on The Nonprofit World. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you, Claire, for sharing your story.
Jerry.
It's been delightful. We'll see you next time.